I'm so excited to bring you today my interview with Jake Morrissey, author of The Genius in the Design, Bernini Borromini, and the Rivalry that Transformed Rome. I've referenced and used this book a lot in my teaching. I ask all my students to read this. I now give free tours in the city of Rome that walk through the life and work of these two architects. The whole Italian Baroque can be explained just through these two architects. It is a story of power, of the popes, of the church, of murder, of passion, of love triangles, architecture, art. It is really much more a novel, a movie, than an actual biographical architectural history. And you just do not get taught this in school. That's why I asked Mr. Morrissey, why is this not core curriculum in an architecture school? So to my audience that usually listens to me in Spanish, you can subtitle this video if you need to. And to any new audience listening to me in English for the first time, I hope that you like this interview and that you like and subscribe. So here it is, my interview with Jake Morrissey. Mr. Morrissey, Jake, it's so nice to have you here in this interview. I'm really appreciative of your time. You're right now in New York.
I'm actually, yes, I'm actually sitting in New Jersey, but I used to go in before the pandemic to New York every day as a commuter.
Right. And for our audience, who most of them are young architects or young students studying architecture or young architects that have just come out of school, it is a personal treat for myself, and it will be for you. If you haven't had a deep dive into the lives of these two architects, because I once walked into a Barnes & Noble store in Texas, into the architecture section, where usually you don't find much. And by luck, found myself with this book, which author is here with us today, Mr. Jake Morrissey. Jake. And we're here to discuss about him and about this book and these two architects, Bernini and Borromini. So let's get straight into it. Jake, you don't come from an architecture background.
No, I am an English major and a journalist by training, but I've always been interested both in architecture and in telling stories. I wanted, when I got to college, I wanted to be an architect, and frankly, the math classes that I was required to take were frankly too much for me. So I had to find my interest in architecture elsewhere, which is how I got into the story about Bernini and Borromini and the kind of rivalry that they basically spent their lives competing against each other, and the Rome we know of today basically is because of that rivalry.
Absolutely. Now, you touched upon a few subjects there that are important for someone like myself, who's an architecture teacher, professor. You know, we say professor in Spanish, but professor in Europe sounds a lot more, you have to have like a PhD. And some people are very kind of like, are you adjunct professor or assistant professor?
How much of a professor are you?
Yes. In Spanish, in Mexico, we say maestro, which actually means master. So it's like sifu in China. But actually, a core thing of my design studios when I teach is that buildings need to tell the story.
Yeah.
So when you say that you were interested in being an architect and that you have also always been interested in telling stories, that's kind of like, that's right where I sit in, and that's where I like to be. Now, because of your interest in architecture before, did you actually enroll in architecture class? You did take classes, or is it pre-enrolling?
Well, the way the program, I went as an undergraduate to the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. And the way the program worked is you had to take a series of requirements before you were admitted into the architecture school. And it became very clear very early on in my studies that while others were able to study architecture further, I was not. So I had to kind of pivot pretty quickly. But I've always been interested in architecture, and I kind of read, and I've always read both, stories about sort of famous buildings or structures, whatever, and also the architects themselves. I was, even as a kid, I was interested in those, those magazines of like floor plans of houses. And you would kind of sort of sit there and sort of try to figure out what the house might live like or be like. And then as I got older and started to sort of hear, I was interested in, oh, I don't know, how the Eiffel Tower was designed, or who built the Empire State Building, or and then I sort of realized that there were people behind these stories, mostly men, particularly early on, but things like I got interested in Andrea Palladio.
Mm.
And then I sort of came across a while ago a book called Brunelleschi's Dome, which was the story of how the great Duomo in Florence was built, and that kind of led me down a rabbit hole of thinking about what else was going on, and I came across sort of separately the kind of stories of Bernini and Borromini and how their lives and personal and professional lives overlapped. And I am not an architect, obviously. I'm not an art historian. I'm a book editor by that's what I do for a job. So I was saying to my literary agent, I said, I actually have what I think is a good idea for a book. It's about these two guys who didn't like each other very much, but they were both each was as good as the other, and the way they designed things became the Rome that we go visit. And do you have an author who might be interested in telling that story? And because she's a smart literary agent, she looked at me and she said, why are you giving away a perfectly good book idea to somebody else? And I was, oh, you think I could write it? And she's like, of course you can. So I started the sort of, it took probably 2.5 years to kind of put together the research in and around my real job and family to sit down and be able to tell the story of, Francesco Borromini and Gianlorenzo Bernini and what they have to say to us today.
That's amazing. Now, so you came to know of their existence and their story and their work through the Renaissance and Brunelleschi's Dome, in a way, yes. No? Yes. So that was your intro to then the Baroque with these two characters. Now, I say the word character on purpose because I'm wondering if you ever thought what I've thought, that this is a very in potentia screenplay. This needs
this is a miniseries. Totally. This is a Netflix series waiting to be written by somebody. Absolutely. I mean, literally, when I tell the stories of these guys, somebody actually said to me, are you making this stuff up? It's like, dude, no, this happened. These people were incredibly talented. They were smart. They were ambitious. They held a grudge. They were both incredibly sort of social and pious, and probably one of them was a depressive. It's like, if I made this up, you'd say to me, this can't be true, but it's all true.
And we'll get into that because, as in your book, you point out, there's many times conflicting evidence and accounts. That's a good account, written accounts by different authors that say different things. So then it becomes, well, who do you believe? What's the fact? What's
exactly?
It's probably the truth is somewhere in between. But before getting into all those nitty-gritty details and all the, the meat of the story, with regards to book editing, because that is your profession, right. As well as an author, you put two interesting quotes as is that how you call it? You call it a preface?
They're called epigraphs.
Mm-hmm. By Seneca, and I'm mostly interested in your selection in the second one, and I would just like to pick your brain as to what you were thinking when you selected this one in particular. It reads, I have the book here. It reads, "There is no great genius without some touch of madness." Seneca.
Well, to me, that sort of speaks to both Bernini and Borromini in the sense that these guys were geniuses, but they were, one of them maybe more than the other might have been mad or insane, but they were certainly not like the rest of us. A lot of us, work really hard to do as good a job as we can in our lives, and some of us do a very good job. And then there are the people who are sort of above and beyond, who create extraordinary art or buildings or music or lead us, brilliantly or whatever. And these two men were essentially, they created the Baroque that we know today. The kind of the Italian, the Italy that we know today, the Baroque that we know today comes from these two people. And it's, you can discuss this and we can have, debates about it all, but the world would look very different if these two guys had never been born. And I think that within them, there's both genius and madness. And I think that's what drew me to the Seneca quote, because it's the world that Bernini and Borromini lived in celebrated the artist maybe in a way that we have not seen since. These guys were literally at the center of certainly European art and culture. Rome at the time was sort of the center of, all art sprung from that, or what was considered good art. Anyway, the idea that somehow these two guys can create things that, even now, Borromini has built things that architects now are still drawing inspiration from. And I think that's an amazing thing to say sitting here 450 years later.
Absolutely. Frank Gehry and artist Richard Serra have both been mesmerized by walking into San Carlino. And that's a very powerful statement you made, because of course, without them, Rome would be different. And without Rome at that time, architecture history timeline might have taken a different path, totally. Right? I myself am not a fan of the Baroque, and the Rococo then got to an extreme. However, you cannot be in awe of it, right? So I think that celebration of artistry is a bit, in a way, decadent, of course, but that's what made it so special as well. And it taught us a lot. Now, to the book editor with me in this interview, I asked two questions, which are, and you can choose which one to answer or which one to dive more into. It's a pretty long title. I don't know if you would pitch this title to another. Of course, in the end, the title is Genius in Design, which I think is correct, but that doesn't tell you much of what you're about to read.
Right.
And the other one was, how does one go about selecting a cover image for this book? And I found that there was not enough photos inside of it for all the things that are being described.
Right. Well, both of those questions that you're raising are things that editors that I literally grapple with every day.
Right.
And the goal of, and this may be a little bit too much in the weeds, but the goal of a hardcover jacket, a paperback cover, think of them as movie posters. These are things that are designed to get you in the Barnes & Noble in Texas to pull it off the architecture shelf and walk to the cash register. That's the goal.
Right.
So what we try to do is basically entice the reader to do precisely that. So titling this book was frankly tricky, because what I'm essentially writing about is, yes, I'm writing about these two guys, these two artists, but I'm writing about a rivalry. And in some ways, what you do as a book editor is I can have I might think as a memorable book, as a memorable title that might not necessarily tell you much about what the book is, but the subtitle has to tell you precisely what the book is, which is why this book is called The Genius and the Design, Bernini, Borromini, and the Rivalry That Transformed Rome. And so together, the reader, I hope, gets a sense of what this might be about, the architects and Rome and that sort of sensibility. Now, it's completely, there's no science behind this. It's no data-driven, we don't do data analysis or whatever, but this is kind of what we hope is a gut reaction. So to go into the details about what the images are in the book, every image that's in the book is a cost to the author. Now, I drew the illustrations myself. So the illustrations are there, and they're not by any means, sort of architect quality, but they were, I hope, illustrative of the kinds of things that I was interested in. So, but buying the photographs for this book, and you're right, there aren't many of them, maybe a dozen or so, 10. I could have used more. At the same time, this is an economic sort of situation where you sort of try to find the balance between telling the story and showing illustrating what I'm talking about, while at the same time not turning this into a picture book with long captions. So it's all basically a balancing act, trying to get your story told in as evocative and as compelling a package that you can put together. I will say that the cover of the hardcover, the jacket of the hardcover, is different than the jacket of the cover of the paperback. And I actually prefer the paperback jacket because I think it's more friendly. If that's the right term. I mean, I think that's, and by the way, the jacket is a decision on the part of the publisher. The publisher determines what goes on the jacket. Right. So, I mean, I offered my opinion, but they decided to do one thing, and then for the paperback, did something else. The interesting thing, of course, is looking to see what the book is sold, I think, in 6 or 7 countries. It's interesting to sort of see how they, nobody did the jackets that are on the American editions, which was, I thought was interesting.
Now, this is getting to the end of the book nerd questions, let's say. But so I found out about the hardback while doing a little bit of extra research for our interview. Now, is the hardback the first edition? Yes, the hardback comes out first, and then usually about a year later, the paperback comes out. And so which edition from the paperbacks, would you be able to recognize this, or? Yes, that's the paperback, yes. Okay, so there's been one edition on hardback and one edition in paperback. Well, I mean, there might have been reprints, but generally what happens is when there are reprints, the same package is sustained within the English language edition, for example. The reason why I go into this, and hopefully this will be subtitled, our video, most of my audience in Mexico is bilingual, but still we like to always include subtitles when it's an English interview. I always tell my students when they're going about creating their library, which is really important for anybody, but for an architect, is that if you're going to buy a book of a recent publication, go on to eBay or go on to Amazon and try to see if there's a used first edition, and try to always have the first edition of the book. 20 years down the line, you might be very happy with what happens, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why, and sometimes it's hard to find out if what you're holding is a first edition or not. Totally. And I actually, that's interesting you said it, because one of the things that I have done over the pandemic is start to look at possibly acquiring first editions of books that I'm interested, that I like. I mean, I'm not a collector, but I have bought a couple of them over time. And you're right, they can be hard to find, and a good investment if you are trying to sell a book of first edition, 20 years from now. It's amazing how much they can go up in price. It just becomes valuable. Yes. I just bought my first old book. One of my architectural heroes is Jacques-François Blondel in Paris, and he published his courses on architecture and managed to find those in a suitable price. Well, Jake, moving on forward to our discussion, getting into not exactly yet these two architects, but broader architecture questions that have to do with your profile as somebody who's interested in this topic, in these two men. I see them as Mozart and Salieri, but I want to get a feel for you as to not just them, but also architecture in general. Now, it's not a tradition, but certain few famous architects have changed their names. And I couldn't help notice that as an author, your two books, two books that I know of that are authored by you, Weekend at Blenheim, and Genius in the Design, you changed how your name comes out. Right. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Sure. What happened was, as I said, I'm a book editor, and I was at my wife and I were at a friend's house for dinner, and I was talking to this woman who was a literary agent, and I said, I've had this thinking about a story that I wanted to tell that takes place at Blenheim Palace, which is one of the largest private homes in England, which was where Winston Churchill was born. And so the literary agent said to me, "Oh, I think I could sell that to a publisher. When you finish that, tell me." So I did, and she sent it to me, and she sold it. It's a historical mystery. It's complete fiction. But because I was a book editor, and I had I published mostly, not exclusively, but mostly nonfiction.
I thought, you know what, maybe because it's if it's novel, I'll use my initials, which
Oh,
is
I see.
J.P. Morrissey. So I did, and then I was surprised by the number of people said, "Why don't you want to use the name Jake Morrissey?" And so when I came up with the idea for A Genius in the Design, and my agent sold it again, I had less. I was more comfortable calling myself Jake Morrissey. So both are correct, if you will, but probably Jake Morrissey is closer to who I am.
Right. Yeah, because famously, Le Corbusier in architecture was not called Le Corbusier.
Right.
And actually, our character of today, one of the two characters, Borromini, was not called Borromini,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Castelli.
Castelli, that's right.
So, okay, interesting. Jake, and I feel a little bit strange calling you Jake, but I will do it. I'll say Jake. I'll get more comfortable.
You guys are the experts. I'm simply somebody who's an interested bystander.
No, not at all. I mean, I know you frame yourself not as an expert, but the research done with this, which I'm going to ask you, is pretty incredible. Now, what is your opinion in general, having kind of been around architecture and involved with architecture in the sense, not directly as an architect?
Right.
How do you see architects contemporarily?
I mean, the interesting thing is, to me is, and I think I came across this quote that Nicholas Pevsner said, and I think it's true in the research for this book. He said, he was talking about artists. He said, for a while, a poet and a painter can forget about their age and be great in the solitude of their study and studio. An architect cannot exist in opposition to society. And I think that's really true. You guys have to be part of the world around you. And I think that's what makes architecture so interesting, is that you might have an individual vision, but at the same time, you have to work with, everything from planning committees to clients who might or might not understand what you're trying to do, to figuring out how to find the supplies to build the buildings that you're trying to create. So it's a whole process of being both an artist and kind of a little bit of a magician. I mean, you're keeping all of the balls in the air at the same time, while trying to sort of be true to, everything from a budget to what you want the building to look like at the end. So I think you guys kind of are kind of masters at a lot of different kinds of skills that I just sort of sit here in awe at, because it's an extraordinary experience to go from simply lines on a computer screen to a finished building, be it, a simple house or a 100-story office building.
There's a story that Frank Gehry tells when he first met Sidney Pollack. I don't know if you ever heard about this, but I want to share it with you because it ties into that quote. Apparently, Gehry insulted on purpose at this dinner table when he met Sidney Pollack, the famous, now deceased Hollywood director.
Right.
And he told him, "Oh, you think you're a hot shot? You're not an artist. What I do and what my friends do," because Gehry was also hanging around with a lot of artists, and that's where he got his inspiration to kind of do very different architecture. We're artists. You're Hollywood. Mr. Hollywood is all about money. It's all about meeting quotas and making money for your investors. That's not art. And apparently, Sidney Pollack said, wait a minute, Frank. Yes, I have got a pro forma to fill out. I need to make money for my investors. But out of all that, my movie, there's a 10% there. That's mine. That's my art. And I can do whatever I want with that. So I think many times architects have to, the architect, you're talking about service providers. We are the service of our community and our clients. We're providing a service. That's why we're being hired. But we have a sometimes hidden, sometimes very egotistical agenda to add to the conversation of architectural history, to put in a little pebble on that can sometimes be to the detriment of the client or work or, budget wise and all these kinds of. So it's a difficult line to walk on. But I think it makes a lot of sense, that 10%.
Well, also the idea that you guys are constantly, the line changes every day. You walk into, in a building project, it's, okay, well, this is late, or we can't get this, or great good news, we can get this, so we can do X. So it's one thing. I deal with authors every day, and part of the experience of being an author is it's very lonely. You sit down at your computer and you have to come up with, the line is, you sit down at your desk and you open a vein and you tell a story. Architects, I think, in many ways, they do tell a story, but it's not just them. As Frank Gehry said, as Sidney Pollack said, it's very much of a kind of a collaboration. The compromises you have to make literally every day to make sure that the next thing you're going to finish the project, whether it's the renovation of somebody's kitchen, or building building the Sydney Opera House or whatever. Yeah. So the idea that you are always kind of in this kind of dynamo, trying to kind of find the balance that in the chaos, I think is it's a credit both to your patience and also your talent. I mean, I take my hat off to architects every day.
Well, that's very nice to hear. And Gehry, by the way, says that he then called back that night Sidney Pollack and apologized and said, you know what, I've been thinking about this. And you're absolutely right. It's the same in architecture. I've got only 10%. So, exactly. So he kind of came back from his artist position. Jake, can you walk us through how once you got to know these two characters, Bernini and Borromini, and then you decided this would be a great idea for a book instead of pitching it for someone else and giving that jewel away to do it yourself? How did you go about this research? Did you get access to kind of difficult to get to archives? Did you travel there? Obviously, your bibliography is in here for references, but can you tell us about that experience? You said it was 2 years.
Yes. Well, I'm a reporter by training. I mean, a journalist by training. So what I do is my instinct, if you will, is to is to dig deep, do research, and talk to people. So what I did was I made several trips to Italy, some with my family and some by myself, and I started talking to people, people in my world, friends, whatever. Do you know anybody who might know somebody in Italy, in Rome or whatever? And what happened is when I started talking, I started getting directed to people, and what I ended up what I ended up finding a woman an American woman who had lived in Italy for decades, who was the president of the Association of American University and College Programs in Italy. And so she has lived in Rome for decades, and I basically cold called her, I mean by email, but basically wow. And said, would you be willing to sort of talk to me about some people I might be able to sort of talk to about the Bernini and Borromini? And she couldn't have been nicer. And so she led me to another academic, an Italian scholar who translated the 17th century Italian for me. Now, I know enough Italian to get myself into trouble, on the, Corso Vittorio Emanuele. I mean, I cannot, my expertise in 17th century Italian would not be great. But she was a visiting scholar at the American Academy in Rome. So I went over there, and she was incredibly gracious to do the translations for me. I got to use the American Academy in Rome library. I was able to get into the Vatican Library. I got into some of the places that are not open to the public that were designed by Bernini and Borromini. I went to Borromini's hometown, which is a small town in Lombardy. Now, no? Yeah. Actually, it's still actually it's on the border. It's still actually in I think it's still in Italy, called Bassone. And walking the streets of Bassone, I suddenly had a really strong sense of why Borromini kind of felt the way he did and why he designed the book, because it's a very narrow, kind of constricted place that's also very sort of tense and dramatic. I know I'm sounding pompous here, and I don't mean to, but I mean, I think it's a good idea to go to the places where you that you want to write about. I went to, the churches that Bernini and Borromini designed. I went to sort of see some of the sculptures that Bernini had done. I sort of, basically tried to get anywhere I could, essentially as a journalist, to try to find people to sort of talk to them about these two architects and their art I went to their burial places. And the one place I did not go to that I probably should have, but I couldn't get in, was the Albertina in Vienna, which has a lot of Borromini's papers, essentially. So while I was able to find a lot of research about Bernini and Borromini, it would have been nice to have done, as I did in the Vatican Library and in the American Academy Library, sort of get to more primary sources than I did.
That's one thing that I've wondered. And by the way, that's a very beautiful way you painted. Now I have to go to Bisogna, of course, to feel that. Because I had the question, it's a tradition nowadays with contemporary architects that you almost start building your archive in life, so that it's more or less organized by the time you die, and then that can be some sort of financial windfall for your relatives, or just because you want it to then be published in a way or taken care in a way, your drawings, your models, all that. So I was wondering, in Mexico, our famous archives are the Louis Barragan archive and the Mario Pani archive. The Louis Barragan was bought by the Swiss foundation Vitra. And the Mario Pani, who is an Italian-Mexican, is bought by university. Now, so you mentioned now this place in Austria, in Vienna, that has Borromini's writings. Is this like a diary? Is this his notebooks? Is this an archive?
I think it's a lot of his papers. I think it's like, here are my, I'm scribbling to see what, San Carlo might look like or whatever. I mean, I think, and again, I've not seen it.
Because you didn't get to go to see it.
Right. And that's on me. I should have made more of it, because I was not surprised, but I mean, I got into places that, as I said, that by asking the right questions and talking to the right people, I was able to get into in Italy. And I should have made probably more of an effort to get into the Albertina in Vienna.
No, but I asked because it seems that that's like something that I would expect should be published, especially as when we understand that Borromini at his time and death was not really much reference afterwards. And he was sort of kind of, in a way, I hate when people say this, but he was in a way rediscovered and seen in a different light hundreds of years later in that sense. Yeah. So I think that's a very valuable thing, if those are papers that would be compiled and published just as for reference, no?
Right. And I think, I mean, again, I don't want to sort of speak for them, but I do think there are, I think whatever, this work I did was maybe 10 years ago. So I think the world may have changed. Because I mean, in other words, the whole idea of, you can sit at your computer and in, 4 keystrokes, sometimes can find things that, 10 years ago, you actually, I mean, for me, getting into the Vatican Library was like donating a kidney. You sort of, you got in and you got your appointment and you got the approval to go on to the next step. And then you sort of, went into this person's office and with this one form, and he approved it, and that allowed you to go to the next step. I mean, it was a whole, as you would expect, kind of Italian bureaucratic, something that's almost a farce, because it was like, wait, I have to go. Literally, I can see the door to the library over your shoulder, but I still have to go here to get one more thing stamped. So the idea of how things might be available now could very well be very different and much easier. So I could imagine that in the end of the day, after all this process, most probably at the end of the day, you end up after months and months and flying there and maybe not being able to access and flying back. In the end, you're going to get to a box where you're going to have gloves. You're going to pull out these papers, and there's no Control F function, and you might not have enough time to find what you're looking for, and it might have not even been there. So. Yes. No, look, is it empathetic or sympathetic? I always mix that one up. Well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I found value in going to, to Lake Lugano and just wandering around where, Borromini walked. I went to the building that Bernini lived in with his family. I didn't go into the building because it's private, but I mean, just sort of getting a sense of what it was like. standing at the square in San Giovanni de Fiorentini where Borromini is buried, just to sort of get a sense of what it was like to be in these places where these artists and architects have lived, just to sort of get a sense of how of what I thought, what occurred to me as I was standing here, having done the research, having talked to people, basically, what did I think and feel when I did that? And being the opinionated sort that I am, I had views.
Okay.
So, to me, it's one of those things where as a journalist, as a reporter, it was a lot of basically, going and doing the work and, asking the questions and standing there and going to the places and then drawing insights from those.
Amazing, because that works perfectly to let's now dive into these two people and the opinions that you have of them, because I'm curious. We are sold as architects the stereotype of these two men, Bernini being a very charismatic, good looking, from a well-off family. And then we get this picture of Borromini as the genius. When they say the director's director or the architect's architect, yes, kind of thing.
Yes, exactly.
Troubled, no friends. So the complete opposite. It's sometimes said that he didn't come from wealth, but I don't buy that, because he studied architecture. He came from the stonemason family, and he was able to travel. And his relative was Carlo Maderno, so he couldn't have been that badly off. Now, my question here is, that's what we get. They're black and white, complete opposites, and both geniuses, both different types of geniuses, I would say. How did they evolve in your head from when you first thought of the idea after you researched and wrote the book? What is your sense of Bernini? What is your sense of Borromini, having gone through that whole thing?
It's interesting you put it that way. I think I actually think Bernini is at heart a sculptor. Borromini is at heart a master stonemason. They're both brilliant architects, but I think they come to the buildings they created through those particular prisms. Bernini was essentially, at least from where I'm sitting, he was essentially a showman. He built, in a weird way, movie sets. Or stage sets. I mean, you walk into his churches, or you walk into St. Peter's and see the Beldoquino, which is the bronze canopy above the tomb of St. Peter and the main altar, and it looks like something you would see on a stage on Broadway. You go into a building that Borromini designed, San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, which was sort of his first great commission. Even though it's a tiny church, it's really, really small, and you go in, and it's an unbelievable experience in kind of dramatic, dynamic tension in stone, frozen, and you stand there and you think, this place is about to explode. And so there's a whole sense of these two men whose personalities were kind of so infused in the architecture that they designed, is that you can't not appreciate what they've created. At the same time, I don't think I could sit here and say to you, Bernini is at heart an architect, or Borromini is at heart an architect. Unlike, say, Carlo Maderno, who was Borromini's, he was a relation of Borromini's mother. He came from, who designed the St. Peter's Basilica that we know today. He's the one who moved it from a Greek cross, which Michelangelo and others had, and extended the nave so it became a Latin cross, and then built the facade. The church that we know today that's St. Peter's is because of Carlo Maderno. So now, these guys, I think, were really, 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 really brilliant architects. But ultimately, I would not say that they were architects, if that makes any sense.
I just to add to that, I mostly say that, I agree with what you said about Bernini being at heart a sculpture artist. And if you've seen his sculptures, they're just amazing.
Astonishing.
and why they're in the Vox Populi or in people's heads, they're not up there with Michelangelo's work, I don't know. And maybe that's because Michelangelo is much more known as a sculptor artist than an architect, and Bernini is much more known as an architect instead of sculptor artist. It's a weird situation. Yeah. But you mentioned St. Peter's. And of course, St. Peter's, and you mentioned the Baldachin. And that's, in a full circle way, that's where this begins and that's where this ends. But just to get the Carlo Maderno thing out, I've got two questions there, because one is, I've seen blood relative, I've seen relative or loose relative, I've seen or heard uncle. Is it actually known? You mentioned his mother.
I mean, I believe from the research that I've done, I don't believe Maderno was Borromini's uncle. I don't think it was his mother's sister. I think it was one of those things where she was related to him. She was related to Maderno, and came from a family of sort of stonecutters in Lombardy. And Maderno had gone south to Rome and had become essentially the, kind of the chief architect of St. Peter's. And so there was definitely a blood relation, but I don't think it was like, Uncle Carlo, give me a job. It wasn't, right. I don't think it was the Sopranos. I think it was more okay. a chance for, a young, ambitious stonecutter who had a great sort of knowledge and interest in sort of, moving forward, being able to sort of, essentially knock on the door of a relation of his mother's to be able to say, hey, can you give me an entry-level job? Can I learn from you and start to, make a name for myself? And
Maderno, and because there's two questions in here. So Maderno must have been like, oh, yes, I know your mother. She's like my second cousin. And like, right. Oh, this is you can do this sort of work. Yeah, I'll give you work. And then he started getting more and more responsibility.
Yes,
that totally. Makes sense. Now, totally. The two questions here are the extension from Greek cross to Latin cross that was done under Maderno. Now that's a key word, under Maderno. My sense of what I've read, and it's been highly criticized by architects, that move, was that was an order from the Pope.
Yeah.
And the result of this was then now the running joke is that you can see Michelangelo's dome from everywhere in Rome except when you're in front of it.
Which is completely true. Which is why, and we'll get to this in a minute, which is why the church of Sant'Agnese in the Piazza Navona is a direct counterpoint to that, because you can see the dome yes. of Sant'Agnese by yes. standing in front of, and that was intentional.
Yes, and I usually with my students, because we're in Mexico, and the U.S. is our neighbor, I usually reference the Capitol building. I think you referenced that in your book as well. Am I right or wrong on that?
I think so. Yeah.
Sant'Agnese. Okay, that's a good one. Also, now sometimes you read different authors and you read different things, and sometimes you make up stuff in your head. So at some point, it's difficult to separate fact to what you've sort of idealized in your own self. And somewhere in my head, and I'm pretty sure this is made up by me, there's a feeling that Borromini left his house in northern Italy without really informing his family. So he ran away from home because the family didn't want him to be an architect. But in these times, an architect and a stonemason were really much par for the course the same. So what did you find out in your research about this?
Well, what happened was when Borromini got older, he left Lombardy and he went down to Milan. The cathedral, the Milan cathedral was in the process, was being built.
The Duomo.
So I went down, the Duomo. So I went down there to basically to work as a stonemason and stonecutter. And what happened was Borromini, he collected a debt that was owed to his father, to Borromini's father. And rather than go back to Bissone and give the money to his father, he took the money and went to Rome. So it's like, sorry, mom and dad, hasta la vista, I'm heading south. So it was a kind of a ballsy move on the part of a young, ambitious, who certainly was talented, but who was very much of a craftsman. He was not born as a kind of an effete artist. As you say, he probably by certain levels was comfortably off in terms of, he wasn't poverty stricken,
Mm.
but he obviously had to work, but he had actually had ambitions. So he took the money that his father was owed and went down to Rome and essentially knocked on Maderno's door and said, can you help me? And that became exactly, and that became an extremely effective and successful relationship, because Maderno basically, he became Carlo Maderno's kind of primary assistant.
Absolutely. That was his catapult. Now, but insofar as your research, there's no letter from Borromini to his family saying why he was taking the step and going to Rome. And there was no discontent from the family ever saying, no, you should be a stonecutter, never try to be an architect. He was still trying to be a stonecutter.
Well, I mean, I think, I obviously can't speak for him, but there's no research that I found that said, okay, I am destined, I want to be an architect and this is how I'm going to do it. I think it was a function of, this is an opportunity I want to take, or this is a chance I have to, to do something rather than, cut stone in the Lombard hills of northern Italy. Now, as you know this as well as I do, back then, as Bernini and demonstrated, you could be an architect and a sculptor and a painter and Bernini produced a play. The separation of jobs or duties or whatever was not something that we have today, was not something that they experienced.
Correct. I think that's a good context for the people who are listening, because at this time, the idea of the academy, so going to study under sort of an institute or university model, was just starting. It had started in Florence and then died very quickly with a Neoplatonic academy by the Medici, from where Da Vinci and Michelangelo had some experience in. And then eventually, years on, it would be instituted as the Royal Academy, which was for the kings. So because the kings needed their architects to build bridges and fortifications and castles and palaces. Now, the authority, and this time in Rome, is of course the Pope. And we'll get to the popes. So, okay, the Beldoquino. So long story short, Maderno hires Borromini. Borromini is working with him. He becomes, in a way, a father figure. He starts getting more and more responsibility and eventually dies. His idea for extending the extension of the cross planned for St. Peter's was not his idea. It was a request from the Pope, which was his boss. He had to oblige, in a sense. You don't go against the Pope, except if you're Bernini, which we'll get to that later. But then, so Bernini has been being trained in the Vatican because one of the bishops saw him at his father's workshop doing sculptures and saw some talent and started fostering it. And eventually the idea became that this could be the new papal architect. And they tried him out at Santa Viviana, where he was 21 years old. He had done these amazing sculptures, which I've had a gorgeous time with at Galleria Borghese, together with students. And seeing photos of them really does not give them justice. I also think, well, sometimes it's actually better to see the photos with the black backdrops, because the setting for Galleria Borghese is overwhelming in an image. But if you go see them, then your eye can focus on the real sculpture. Anyway, I've extended myself. Maderno dies, and the Pope sees the opportunity to test his papal architect and puts him as the person in charge for what is the most important building in all of Europe. A 22, 23-year-old kid with no experience.
Right.
Now, my speculation of conversation between Borromini and Bernini there is like, well, let's collaborate. Look, you're a great sculpture artist. You're a great stonemason. You know about structure. You know about engineering. I'm more about form making. So let's work together. And the first assignment was to build this Beldoquino. And it goes wrong.
Well, the interesting thing about what you just said is essentially what happened was a Pope, Urban VIII, who was a member of the Barberini family, wanted to had sort of his family had essentially discovered Bernini at a young age as this kind of precocious illustrator, and sculptor, and essentially wanted him to be, in the kind of papal retinue in order to basically focus his energies on, creating work for the papacy. And when Maderno died, initially at any rate, Maderno had been given the commission to create the Beldoquino, but it was very, very clear that, you're past it. Okay. So it was going to go to Bernini. So essentially, when Maderno died, Bernini, at a very young age, was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's and was responsible for basically everything in the building. Now, remember, at the time, the building had been built, the nave had been extended, but the marble on the floor had to be created, the niches had to be designed and input, the sort of the marble of the walls had to be chosen and built. So there was a lot of stuff to do. And Bernini was somebody who, was the teacher's pet, if you will. The great find and the great artist of the urban papacy. And Borromini was a talented, but ultimately sort of secondary character in sort of the design that Urban wanted for his papacy.
But let me interrupt you. Sorry, let me interrupt you very quickly there. So are you saying that before Maderno died, yes, because he was the chief, he was going to be doing the Beldoquino, but that Bernini was sort of earmarked to do this piece because it was understood more as a sculpture, actually?
Exactly. Now, the Beldoquino is this something like 80-ton piece of bronze, which is 4 sort of twisted Solomonic columns that stand on the main altar of St. Peter's. And it's in religious history, in Catholic history, it's supposed to be a kind of a beautifully decorated cloth that the bearers kind of hold one in each corner.
It's very light.
Exactly. It's supposed to be, anyway. And it became this, when you walk into the doors of St. Peter's, you can see down the nave, hundreds of feet away, this incredible piece of half architecture, half sculpture. So essentially, Bernini was responsible, with Borromini's help, for designing and having, I'm not even sure what the right word is, forged to create this kind of covering of the main altar. And when you go to see it or see pictures of it, it's incredibly detailed. The twisted columns are supposed to be reminiscent of some of the columns that were in the Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. There are salamanders and bees, on the ivy that kind of grow up, and as kind of a private joke, because the symbol of the Barberini family was the bee. So it was, if you kind of look at the detail, a lot comes out more than just simply saying, oh my gosh, this is a really big piece of bronze or whatever. And so Bernini was responsible in some ways for the art of it, the artifice, the drama, and a lot of the sort of technical issues were worked on with Bernini and Borromini together. And that, I think, it's impossible to tell who did what, but a lot of the designs of and sort of images that we still have are in Borromini's hand. So he definitely was involved in this.
The working drawings, yes. You're saying. Bernini was definitely a good salesman, including the little bees, which are the symbol for the Pope everywhere. Totally. So that afterwards we could say, oh, this is the Pope who commissioned this, and this is their legacy. Yes, it's hard to grasp the scale when you're there, because it's 30 feet tall. And as you say, it's 80 tons. It's massive. Now, but here's the issue. They collaborate in a way beautifully. Bernini brings his form-making, sculpture, and rhetoric. Borromini brings a technical side. And if you're the technical person, you need to draw to be able to communicate what's going to get built. Yeah. If you're form-making, you need to draw to communicate how it's going to look like, right? So it seems like the collaboration worked. At this point, also, they were working together in other of the Pope's things. I'm not sure if the Pope would even know Borromini's name. I'm sure they knew Gianlorenzo's. So now I'm going to get to the question, because what happens is that the first mass happens underneath this baldachin. Very much so, St. Peter's still an active construction site, as you mentioned. And I'm imagining the newspapers the next day praising Gianlorenzo, the young prodigy, and there's no saying of Borromini. Now, do you think that was, in your personal way of thinking, of looking at this, was that oversight, or just that lack of tact, or was that on purpose?
In some ways, I think it could be both. I mean, it's clear that in any collaboration, there's going to be somebody who is the face of it. At the same time, at least at this point, I think Bernini was the sort of ideas guy, and Borromini was the problem solver. For example, what Bernini wanted to have on the top of the Beldoquino a statue of the risen Christ. And Borromini's like, yeah, can't do that. Going to be too heavy. Going to crush the Pope and everybody underneath it. So, the question is like, okay, well, if I can't do this, what can I do instead? And what they ended up compromising on was there's a golden orb on the top of, yes. I think, and then a cross on top of it, which has the advantage of being exactly the same thing that's on the top of the outer dome at St. Peter's. So the top of the Beldoquino mimics the top of the dome that the Beldoquino was under. So it's those sorts of problem-solving skills that Borromini brings to the table, while Bernini has the, as the charming, attractive, gregarious face to the papacy and the world of, this is the genius who brought us this amazing piece of art and architecture that can stand above the sacred tomb of St. Peter.
That sounds like a brilliant collaboration, but Borromini didn't think so. Borromini thought that his name needed to be included amongst the Vox Populi, and my imaginary thinking of that there was news papers printed at that time, or troubadours telling the news, So right. Allegedly he storms out, he quits. He says, you can, I think in your book, if I'm quoting it correctly, he says, you can keep my money, but not the credit of my work.
Right.
My question here is, they were working together on other things as well. Like, for example, the Barberini Palace.
Right. Well, before we get into that, one of the reasons Borromini quit was in the building. I mean, there was still a lot of work, as you said, in finishing St. Peter's, and Borromini had gotten into a business arrangement with Bernini's brother-in-law to provide marble for St. Peter's, and it was like, it was one of those sort of, let's make a buck as we're working so hard kind of thing. So they sort of got into business, and they were getting gigs to actually do all, basically do what they needed to do, and they weren't making any money. And Borromini sort of wasn't quite sure what was happening. And then he started to do some investigating and realized that his partner had gotten into a deal with Bernini, basically to pay Bernini a kickback for every commission that the partnership was supposed to get from the chief architect at St. Peter's. So Borromini was like, that's it, I'm done.
Wow, I thought that it was because being chief architect, Bernini was getting paid more than Borromini. I didn't realize it was because of this kickback.
Oh, he was getting paid more, but it's like, why can't you get paid more than more? So Borromini had kind of bridled. I mean, Borromini was also the only person in Rome who thought when Maderno died, he should become chief architect of St. Peter's, not Bernini. So, Borromini was somebody who was, easily offended, had a great regard for his talent, and an unwillingness to sort of listen to sort of, to some people.
Sounds like no architect I've ever heard of before.
Well, also unlike Bernini, who was able to deal with his clients successfully, Borromini was somebody who always had difficulty doing that. And when it came time to basically break with Bernini, it wasn't, as you say, it wasn't as kind of clean a break as it could have been, because they together were working on the Palazzo Barberini, which was the papal family home that they were in the process of finishing.
Yeah, I would speculate. In my head, I've seen this in the imaginary film or series in Netflix. Actually, Bernini asking Borromini for help, because I would expect, if I was Bernini, even though I'm confident and charismatic, there's an inner world, and I would have been very, very scared of being the architect in charge of that building.
Right.
You needed a team to work on that.
Exactly.
So yes, as you mentioned, Barberini. So they're working together. Now he leaves, Borromini storms out of the work at St. Peter's, the most important building in Western civilization. However, stays on board still. Am I correct in the timelines at Barberini?
Yes. Well, that's the thing, is that there's a lot of sort of overlap, and this goes back to sort of how they worked back then, is that, they were in the process of designing the Barberini Palace. And one of the sort of great things they've done in the building is, if you visit it, it's you go into sort of the courtyard, and you can go to the right or the left, and there is a beautiful, stately, square staircase designed by Bernini on one side. I think it might be the left side as you're looking at it. And it's elegant and formal, and frankly a little dull. And in the sort of same place on the other side is this oval staircase designed by Borromini that literally, when you walk up it, it's almost like you're weightless. It kind of brings you up with such sort of enthusiasm that it's like a joy to go upstairs. And it's interesting to sort of see how two architects sort of dealt with something as prosaic and necessary as stairs, because of course there was no electricity, there was no internet, there was nothing, there wasn't even running water. So the idea that how do you get from point A to point B is, particularly at a home of the most important family in Rome, and therefore one of the most important families in Europe, how they're going to be perceived by the world. And it's a kind of remarkable, Borromini did other things inside at the Barberini Palace, but most of the work was probably Bernini's. But what Borromini did do was amazing.
Now, so I want to dig deeper into that, because I've taken students to the Barberini, and it's a beautiful moment to say, Bernini's staircase, Borromini's staircase. Make up your own mind,
Right, exactly.
But there's much more to that, because let's think about it. They're designing together. They've been collaborating. The collaboration sounds more or less like, look, you're the boss because you're with the Pope. I've been here before, so I'm like, kept on, let's say, with the new boss. You are this genius considered by everybody, sculpture artist. I am technical, let's get down to brass tacks, reality, structure, weight, all these things, budget. It seems like that's how they're working. When it comes down to designing from what we call tabula rasa, from zero, a brand new building, to me, if I walk in there, it seems like Bernini's staircase is way bigger and much more centrally located in the plan, whereas Borromini was giving like this service staircase to one side in this kind of very dimly lit, sort of like a damp corner. That's how it looks to me, like, okay, Borromini, you can design that one. But also, just one more thing, at this point, Urban VIII has died, because this is a new pope. So this is the new pope's palace, the Barberini, correct?
No, Urban was the Barberini.
Okay. Oh, so this is the same pope. This yes. is the main champion of
Bernini.
Bernini.
Yes.
So because at some point I'm like, this pope is playing to see who's the better architect with these two staircases. But then no, it must have just been a discussion between them two.
Well, one of the things that, one of the challenges Bernini had, I mean, if you will, the front door that's the bad way of putting it, but the front door of the Palazzo Barberini is Bernini's staircase, which is why it's more, which is why where it's placed, and that it is very much kind of an impressive and stately approach, if you will, to the upper floors. And if you look at the sort of central courtyard of the Barberina Palace, the first two floors are Bernini's, and Borromini designed the top floor of, and you can sort of see the windows across the top. And the two floors underneath are kind of an archway, and then they're sort of large, tall, arched windows. And then on the third floor, they're also arched, and they're smaller windows, but the Borromini kind of had this kind of interesting sort of trick of the eye, where the stone kind of angles in, so the placement of the window is almost, it's smaller, but it feels the same size than the windows below, because of the way the stone around it is put. So it's a very kind of clever way of manipulating space, keeping balance, but also developing its own sort of sense of kind of, this is what I bring to the table. So it's an interesting, if kind of quiet, comparison between Bernini and Borromini.
Yeah, he does this forced perspective where actually you feel it's a much more deeper window actually than what it actually is.
Totally.
So it seems to me, and yes, I agree with what you say, but for me, the Borromini oval, let's think about the oval plan, because it's going to come back with Borromini. The oval staircase just feels like a haunting space. And it's like, I'm pretty sure these shapes had never seen before, doing an oval staircase in such a tight space, whereas Bernini's is so regal and elegant, and you feel like a horse can go up that central staircase, right? With your carriage.
And probably have, and when we least, we probably don't know how many times that's happened.
But so it feels that he leaves St. Peter's and he stays on board at Barberini because it was being built, and part of it was designed by him, so he went to take care after his own design. Am I on the right vein?
Yes, but it was definitely of limited experience. So basically, when he left St. Peter's, he had to figure out, what am I going to do? And one of the things he did was essentially knock on the doors of religious orders, and he managed to find a group of a poor group of monks called, and I'm not making this up, the Discalced Trinitarians.
Yep.
And it was their sort of mission to essentially try to release some of the or buy back prisoners that were kidnapped by pirates in the Mediterranean. So they were not popular, they were not rich, they were not they were small, and what they needed was they had been given by the Pope, I believe it was Urban VIII, and they were given land in an area called the Quattro Fontane, which is now it's essentially down the street from the Quirinale Palace, which is where one of the houses that the Pope lived in at the time. Anyway, it was a small, kind of narrow, weirdly constricted space. And the Trinitarians asked Borromini to design for them, or he offered to design for them, and they agreed. A dormitory for them, a refectory, basically a dining room, a cloister, and a small church. And what he did over the course of decades was built one of the most imaginative religious spaces or church spaces, certainly in Rome and maybe in the world.
That's a big statement. I mean, it's an amazing place to visit.
Yes.
So the way you just phrased it, it's quite big. And every time you walk in there, there's architecture students sketching it. And Absolutely. It's a tiny space. Not many people can fit in there. Maybe you get 9 benches in the church. And I mean, in Mexico, that's not a church. It's a chapel. That's how small it is.
Exactly. And, and I don't actually know if this is true. The line is always, it's smaller than one of the piers of the dome in St. Peter's. I don't know if that's true, but it's a very, very small space. Yes. And yet, in its own way, it's literally and figuratively unparalleled in the history of America, of world art.
So Borromini becomes his own architect. It doesn't come without financial, let's say, sacrifice, because it's very different to be employed under the Pope to then trying to find your own patrons. Especially these, they were nuns. Descalzos are barefoot,
they were
right?
monks. They were
monks. Okay.
Yeah.
That you mentioned did not have much money. They were getting some sort of a grant by Urban. Now, things are going to change for Bernini. And the things that change for Bernini are that Pope Urban VIII dies and Pope Innocent comes in. And this is is it Pamphile? Pamphile Pope.
Yes.
Pamphile family.
Yes.
And the reign of Urban VIII by him is seen as over the top and having spent too much money and all the things that Bernini was involved in. But also at this point, it's the campaniles, the towers, the bell towers for the facade of St. Peter's.
Yes.
The southern facade, where the southern tower is, it's slumping.
Yes.
Now that site, which is the site for the old St. Peter's, is near the river. So it's a bad foundation. And they were blaming, Maderno's foundation. But then they were saying, well, that was with another designed bell tower. Bernini's bell towers were new, much heavier. And so the new Pope comes in and is not really liking Bernini because he's part of the old administration, let's call it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts the Congregazione, this commission to find out what's going wrong there. And he summons the most knowledgeable architects at the time. And who is in that commission? But of course, Borromini.
Right. Well, what had happened was Urban VIII commanded Bernini to build, as you say, campanile on both sides of the facade of St. Peter's, if you're looking at it on the right side and on the left side. And what had happened was when Maderno extended St. Peter's and then built the facade, the feeling was it was too wide. It needed some height. So Maderno had started to dig foundations for the campanile and came across there were underground springs and marshes and sandy soil, basically unstable soil underneath underneath where the campanile were supposed to be built. But so basically they stopped construction. So, and this was a previous Pope to Urban. When Urban becomes Pope, one of the things he wants to do is build these bell towers for St. Peter's. So Bernini proposed these grand, sort of tall, 3-story towers that were, magnificent and would address the issues of balance between width and height. But Borromini knew that the towers would be too heavy and warned the Pope and Bernini that, basically they wouldn't be sustainable. But the building commenced. The building of the
Bernini's design of the bell towers.
Yes. And what happened was cracks began to be discovered on the facade and inside St. Peter's. Essentially, the weight of the campanile, the south one, particularly the one on the left, as you look at the church, was essentially, the front was essentially dragging down St. Peter's. So this began in, I think it's 1638. And then what happened when sort of Urban began to inspect the bell towers in 1641, he didn't like them because they weren't grand enough. He thought they weren't, so
when Innocent comes in.
Well, and all this stuff was happening, yes. And then eventually Urban dies in the middle of all this. And as you say, Pope Innocent X shows up, who is, in addition to being a sworn enemy of the Barberini family, is basically convenes a commission to discuss what to do about these towers and essentially who's to blame. And as you say, who's standing there but Carlo Maderno's relatives saying, I said this was going to happen, and it turned out that I was right. So what ultimately happened is the commission decreed that the towers were to be torn down, and that the materials would be set aside to be used elsewhere in St. Peter's, and Bernini was to basically pay a fine. And if you could find a more public humiliation in Rome at the time, I can't think of it. I mean, it was like a huge embarrassment for Bernini, who was, of course, the golden boy of
Urban VIII.
exactly, and art in Europe, who basically was told, you know what, you screwed up. You screwed up. You screwed up at the most important church in Christendom, and this is your fault.
However, he was not fired. And however, Bernini, being smart and charismatic, was able to take the blow in a way. He was also very wealthy, so he didn't have to worry financially. But did I sense a little bit of vindication with what you mentioned? Because basically we're saying that the same thing that happened to Maderno when extending the nave because of the Pope, it sounds like Bernini was asked to make the towers grander. Making them grander made them heavier, hence why the foundation was not good enough.
I think that's true. It was also one of those things where I think, at least from what I can see, Bernini had never failed before. He had never really done, I mean, the stories that you read about how precocious he was as an artist. I mean, there's a famous story where I think it was one of the cardinals who had basically hired Bernini to sculpt a bust of him. And Bernini had been doing it and found a flaw in the marble. So before the cardinal came to see it, he basically carved another one. And when the cardinal came to see it, Bernini shows him the first one he carved, and the cardinal was like, "Oh, Gianlorenzo, this is really nice," and tried to sort of hide his disappointment that there was like this flaw in the forehead, in the stone. Right. And then basically, Bernini turns around, takes another, pulls another sort of rabbit out of a hat, and there's a perfectly sculpted bust of the cardinal, who was ecstatic by being both, he went from despair, having to hide his despair, to be just like so joyful that how beautiful, how wonderful the bust was. So that goes back a bit to what I was saying about Bernini being a showman. Yes. So he's never kind of failed publicly. And somebody like Borromini, who had to, he left St. Peter's because he didn't like the treatment he was getting. He thought he deserved better treatment, and he kind of wandered around Rome, trying to get jobs. And let's face it, Rome in the 1600s was not exactly Shanghai in 2021. You're going to bump into each other a lot. So the idea of these two men who kind of can't get, in some ways, out of each other's way, kind of are constantly sort of trying to figure out what they're doing, what they're up to, what's happening, what isn't happening. And one of the jobs that Bernini managed to get for Borromini was the job of designing Sant'Ivo alla Sapienza, which was the church at the University of Rome. That was a commission that he was able to get for Borromini, which became one of Borromini's greatest achievements.
It's one of my favorites. Now, they say in hospitals, I had a girlfriend who was a doctor, deaths comes in threes. So the bell tower is going wrong. Urban VIII has died, of course, so it's the new pope, doesn't take a liking to him. Yeah. Now, we're not going to get into it because it's not necessary, but Bernini has a very public also debacle with a love interest of his with this woman called
Costanza Bonarelli.
Bonarelli, yes. Who his brother was also involved with, Luigi, which was, he almost killed his brother, and he sent a guy to scrape her or put a slash in her face, which is barbaric. But there's another one, which I believe is mentioned in your book, but if you look at it online, there's very little information to find. I believe Luigi was also caught sodomizing a young boy at St. Peter's. Is this correct? One of the Scala Regias, or is that something that I
actually can't remember where it was, but this was later. Yes, I mean Luigi was the brother you don't want. He was I mean. And I know you don't want to get into this, but
oh no, we can. I just want to make sure I don't extend too much time because I value your time. I can go a lot.
I mean, Luigi was one of Bernini's assistants, and he was Well, Gianlorenzo Bernini was having an affair with Costanza Bonarelli, who was also married to one of Bernini's assistants, and it was a passionate affair. And Bernini apparently loved her very much and was extremely possessive. But
Bernini was single at the time, right? He didn't
yes,
have
he
a family.
was very single. Yes, he was the bon vivant of the town. And what happened was he started to hear rumors about Costanza being unfaithful to him, which was kind of rich given that she was unfaithful to her husband. But so to kind of basically trap her, Bernini announced publicly that he was leaving town, and he would leave the next day. So to go out of Rome for a few days. So what he did was he didn't leave. And instead, he sat in his carriage outside of Costanza's house in the morning and saw his brother Luigi leave the house with Costanza in a, shall we say, a state of déshabillé, and he went ballistic. Yes. So he basically ran through Rome with, essentially and beat up his brother, to the point where I think he broke some ribs, and his brother ran to his mother's house, to their mother's house, and she barred the door. And he ended up actually, sort of finding him elsewhere and chased him out all the way through Rome. And at the same time, he had one of his servants go and as you say, slash his lover Costanza's face, basically to mar her beauty. And this was a huge scandal at the time, and was the talk of, and of course the Pope Urban VIII at the time, got to his ears, and he's basically like, dude, gotta punish you. Yeah. But he had a very light punishment. I think he was reprimanded. He might have to pay a little bit of money, which he ended up not doing. And essentially what he said was, you got to get married. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Yeah,
I didn't know that one.
So Urban promised to find the most beautiful woman in Rome for Bernini to marry, which he did. A young woman named, I think it's Caterina Catalina Terzio, I think, who was a lovely young woman, the daughter of a lawyer. Apparently, they were married happily for 34 years, 11 children, and she was very able to sort of deal with the sort of artistic temperament or whatever. But you realize, okay, this is because you are the Pope's favored child, if you will. You can get away with a lot, including almost killing your brother and almost and slashing a
woman's face.
Yes. P.S. The servant who slashed the face went to prison for slashing her face.
Of course, as you would expect. What a punishment for Bernini. I do not know all the intricacies. This is why this conversation is so great. That's amazing. Yes. And I wonder sometimes if in a marketable book, those kind of details are even possible, because then you would end up, like 900 pages, I'm sure.
Right. Well, it's also what you try to do, of course, or at least I try to do, is think about these stories as you might if you're standing with somebody at a party and you're like, yeah, I heard the most amazing story. Yeah. You got a minute? Let me tell you. I mean, I could go into more detail and sort of but ultimately the headlines are incredibly dramatic. And and revealing in the sense of that, look, Bernini did not like being crossed, particularly by his brother, and he certainly didn't like, he operated under double standards. It's like, I can sleep with you, you can be unfaithful to your husband, but you can't be unfaithful to me. It's a huge, sort of double standard that is, that people put up back then, because both of the power that he had powerful friends in the Pope, and also he was the greatest artist of his age,
and he had a high opinion of himself, so he had given himself to her, so she should be appreciative. Exactly. For people listening and watching, there's a bust by Bernini of Costanza Bonarelli, which I've never been able to see in person, but that he had done while he was romancing her, which was weird, because then his assistant would have seen, like, why are you doing a sculpture? Bernini's doing sculptures and busts of, kings and popes, not the wife of his assistant. So it must have been kind of a really power move to do that.
And it's not, and the bust itself is not, she's not formally dressed. She's got like an open neck shirt. You can sort of see the sort of top of her bust, and her hair is kind of disheveled. I mean, this is clearly a woman who has just gotten out of bed. In other words, this is not a sort of formal, let's sit up. This is about, this is a very kind of intimate portrait in marble of of his lover. And he clearly loved her because he kept the, he didn't destroy the bust.
The bust. Now, these faults that we're hearing from Bernini, these fall from grace, coincide with the new Pope, coincide with the bell tower. So Bernini is now out of favor. He's no longer the current Pope's architect.
Right.
And this brings us to one of the most visited squares of Rome, which is Piazza Navona, which I love telling the story of the fountain, but there's a lot of details to this that are sketchy or weird. Yeah. So just to provide a little bit of context, the Pope is creating there his family's house. So this is a Pope Pamphile family, and it's connected to Sant'Agnese Church, right? The residence will be. And he decides that he wants a square outside of it, which used to be one of those old circuses where they had the horses going around.
Back in the Roman days, yes.
Correct. To be a little bit more regal. And so plans are set forth to have some fountains. Borromini now has the ear of the Pope because he's been in the Congregazione and, perhaps he said the right things and he's taken a liking to him, which is a counterpart to the opulence of Bernini, if I can read this correctly.
Well, the thing about Innocent was he knew Borromini was talented. He knew Borromini was, a great architect. And I think Borromini at this particular point benefited from the fact that he was not Bernini. And he was not he was not part of the Barberini family, who essentially had taken as much money from the papacy as they possibly can. So when Innocent became Pope, many of the Barberini family left Italy. A couple of them ended up in Paris. So it was a little bit like, sweeping out the old when the new arrives. And when the Pamphili were building their palazzo, which is to the left of Sant'Agnese, when you look at that side of the Piazza Navona, Innocent wanted he wanted a fountain for the center of the piazza. And in 1647, he appointed Borromini to extend an aqueduct to provide more water to that part of Rome. And it was Borromini himself actually who suggested that the fountain commemorate the world's 4 great rivers, which they thought of at the time as the Nile, the Danube, the Ganges, and the Plata. So Innocent was kind of like, that's a good idea. And the expectation was that the commission would go to Borromini because it was his idea. He was the one who was responsible for bringing the additional water to Rome by working on the aqueduct. And he had gotten the commission to ultimately to design Sant'Agnese or finish Sant'Agnese. So the expectation was when they had a contest or a competition to decide what the fountain should look like, various architects in Rome were asked to provide a design and a model, and Bernini was not asked.
Just to add a little bit more architectural context to that, sure. It seems like, because many times competitions are already set, there's a mock competition, but they already know who's going to win. So it seemed like because of Borromini's previous involvement, he was a shoo-in to win, but to keep appearances, they needed to have a mock competition. Yeah,
the money was on Borromini, and he himself thought he would be getting the commission. So what happened was the Pamphile family, in their own way, were as interested in kind of the sort of social politics of the time as the Barberini were. So there was a man who married actually into the Pamphile family was a guy named Niccolo Ludovisi, who was a friend of Bernini's, who said to Bernini, you know what? Why don't you design a model for the fountain?
Sorry, Jake. I just want to give, because this is really important, I want to give some context to our audience. This is a competition for the Pope for a very central square, where the Pope announces, to keep appearances, that he's going to invite the most celebrated architects to design a fountain. Borromini has been putting the groundwork and bringing the water and has given an idea of what the concept should be for this central fountain. And he's included in the competition. And Borromini's kept out. an architect who's done many fountains around Rome. La
Bernini,
Barca,
yeah, Bernini's kept out.
sorry,
Yes.
Bernini's kept out.
Right.
La Barca and the Tritone fountain, which have been celebrated. So that's a very public slap of we don't want Bernini here.
Right. It's a huge rebuke.
Okay.
Yes,
Right.
totally. And so Niccolo Ludovisi kind of says essentially to Bernini, you know what, build a model, come up with a design and send it to me. So Bernini does this. And so what happens is Ludovisi takes it and brings it to the Palazzo Pamphile and puts it on a little table where he knows the Pope will have to go by it. And essentially, Innocent walks by and saw the model and went crazy for it. He's like, basically, who did this? This is amazing. And that day, Innocent summoned Bernini to the palace and gave him the commission of the Fountain of the Four Rivers. And this came as a complete shock to Borromini, who, several days later, basically stormed through a series of really angry interviews with the Pope and just said, I can't believe you're going to do this. Because at the time, Borromini had been commissioned, Innocent had commissioned Borromini to renovate San Giovanni in Laterano, St. John Lateran, which is essentially the cathedral seat of the Bishop of Rome. It's essentially the Pope's official church, and it's a very prestigious appointment. In some ways, it's sort of the central. The early church was there, and essentially, Borromini got so angry with the Pope for not giving him commission for the fountain that he refused to go back to work at San Giovanni.
To San Giovanni, because I have my timelines mixed up, because Borromini had technically won the competition. And then this friend of Bernini, Ludovisi's, does this trick of showing this model to the Pope. The Pope falls in love with it and has to he wants what's best for his square. And he just says like, sorry, this is Bernini. I don't like Bernini, but look at this model. It's beautiful. We need to get this built. And Borromini,
what happens is, yes, I mean, in some ways it was not official, but it was the betting money was on Borromini because he was. So the idea that it's a little bit like saying, you know what, you've got the in for the job, and then to design this building, and then 5 minutes later it's like, you know what, we decided to go in a different direction. We decided to go with another architect.
With someone who was not even involved in the competition.
Absolutely. Who, P.S., by, at least, the day before yesterday, we didn't talk about because he was so far out of the, sort of the world of Innocent and the Pamphili family, because he had been so closely allied with the previous Barberini family.
He was persona non grata. But I had thought that after this, because the Pope didn't want to insult Borromini, he kind of liked Borromini. So I thought that the work on St. John the Lateran, which is one of my favorite places in Rome, was sort of well, I'm sorry, so why don't you do this afterwards? So he was always commissioned before that then.
Yes, and it's probably safe to say that the longer you know Borromini, the less you probably like dealing with him. He was one of those, he was difficult. He was somebody who, was not shy about expressing himself, and he was not a courtier in the sense that Bernini was. He didn't know how to sort of deal with, the powerful, or if he did, he didn't care. He could be blunt, he could be rude, he could be argumentative, he could be all the things that you don't want in somebody. In other words, if I'm paying you a lot of money, if I'm paying an architect a lot of money, I don't want any lip. You might disagree, but I don't want to hear anymore. Borromini was not afraid to kind of be that sort of guy. And I think what happened over time is that Borromini managed to, irritate, offend, anger more and more people within the power structure in Rome. So it became increasingly difficult for him to essentially get and keep clients.
Any work, yeah. But before getting into that, because I want to talk about allegedly he was dressed in black, and we'll get eventually to his suicide. One question about this model, and this is when you mentioned that there's conflicting information.
Yeah.
There's stories that. So first of all, the original design by Borromini was done for the competition, but I've never been able to find it. I'm wondering if you found it.
I have not, no. And I don't, in all honesty, I don't know if it exists anymore. It may have been destroyed. I will say, thinking about it as over the course of writing this book, I have to say, I think it's kind of surprising that Borromini thought or Innocent thought he should design the fountain. This literally, you go elsewhere in Rome, there are no other fountains by Borromini.
Right.
It's not like you don't think, oh, this is a man who had 3 or 4 beautiful fountains, which you can say about Bernini. So in a weird way, it was kind of it was not the kind of, it's a little bit like
out of his wheelhouse. It's not his thing.
Exactly. So the idea that this is something that he would do. I mean, it makes sense to talk to him about, build me an aqueduct or engineer me an aqueduct that gets more water to Rome. I think Borromini could have done that.
Right.
Build me a beautiful church. Borromini can do that. The fountain seems to me much more sculptural, which was Bernini's forte.
I agree. It's like the soccer player, you got the coach and you're putting your wrong players in the wrong positions, right?
Exactly.
So because it's actually been said that the design for the fountain was not that good. Some people say that actually because he thought the commission was in the bag, he didn't put that much time in it. It might have not been his, like it could have been assistants. There's a lot of stuff said out there, but also Bernini's model doesn't exist. And some people say it was made in silver, and that's why the Pope loved it so much, which doesn't make sense because the Pope is all about being austere. Right. What is your thought about these relics?
I mean, I think in some ways, you're right. I don't actually know where these things are. A silver model seems to me unlikely, given the fact that it had to be done relatively quickly. But I think a model is possible because the point of the fountain was there was an Egyptian obelisk that had been found that they wanted to use as sort of the central pillar in the fountain, and then some sort of version of the 4 rivers around it. And what Bernini had done, and you can still see it today, is he designed essentially a very tall base for this obelisk that has, interesting enough, archways at the base. It looks like it wouldn't support the weight above it, and yet it does. It's a little bit like, let's see, the bell towers at St. Peter's. And then Bernini and his assistants carved the human manifestations of the 4 rivers: the Nile, the Danube, the Ganges, and the Plata. And one of them, can't remember which one. The story is the statue is standing like this, like leaning back, and like the story is it's the one facing Sant'Agnese, the Borromini's church. And oh no, anything but having to look at Borromini, a piece of Borromini architecture. That's not true, but it's kind of a fun story because these 2 great pieces of Roman, art and history are literally feet away from each other.
Now you say that's not true. Do you say that and mean it's not proven? There's no proof of it, or it's proven that it's not true? Well, because I've also heard that it had to do with not only that I don't want to look at Borromini's facade, which is Sant'Agnese, but I've heard accounts or maybe read accounts that says like, oh, it's unstable, it's going to fall on top of me, kind of thing.
Well, I believe, and I certainly am no expert, but I believe the fountain was finished, was there before Sant'Agnese was finished. So it's a little bit like, and Borromini, Sant'Agnese was started by the Rinaldi brothers. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but basically Borromini got a commission late, and as a result of that, I think the fountain was there before the church was. So that's why historically, I think it's probably apocryphal.
The timelines don't match, and I've read this as well. But the problem for me with that, and I know it's difficult, is that yes, Borromini did a renovation on it. So the dates of when a renovation starts and ends is problematic as well. And so it's kind of hard, right? But it's a nice story to tell.
Well, that's the thing. And it's a great story to mention as you're walking by, because it's, it's fun. You're right.
Which I do all the time. I take students there. You have to. Now we're going to start wrapping up with the last two topics, because you're very busy and this has been extremely gracious of you. And I can't be thankful enough. We're going to get to their masterpieces and their designing of their own last resting spaces, places. Now, for the masterpieces, it seems to me as an architect, working as an architect and teaching architecture, that there is a like sort of a unconscious referencing of which are the masterpieces for the architects. And if I dare to suggest to me what the Vox Populi thinks or what's out there, I would say that Bernini, people regard him for his sculptures and the work on St. Peter's. Unfortunately, most of these people think that he did all of St. Peter's and don't know all the architects involved, and et cetera, and that it's more about the square, which I think is very well done and corrects what the Pope forced Maderno's hand to do with a plan. And to Borromini, you mentioned it, San Carlino, of course, is San Carlo Borromeo alla Quattro Fontane, which is so long of a name that it's just called San Carlino in Italy, is regarded as a masterpiece. Yeah. But for me, and I'd like to hear from your side, for me, Santiago La Sapienza is just, I've traveled many places to see buildings. So I travel mostly first to see buildings, then to see people. I then like to see how people work in buildings, like how do they interact. I've never been in a place like Santiago, anything like it. It's like, actually, the way I think of it is that oval-shaped plan space in San Carlino is then transformed in a section and then sort of done in wedges. And the procession of coming from a busy Roman street, open a door to an outdoor corridor, which is usually you open the door into a quiet church, which is covered. Right. It's outdoor, and then you walk through it, kind of like those old, like St. Peter's Church #1, the old one. And then you get to this church, which has a symbol, as you mentioned, like Sant'Agnese. It has that. You can see the dome and the facade at the same point, and then walk into this small space. It's a small church, but so vertical. For me, that's his masterpiece. I want to know from your side, having been involved with these two characters for quite a long time, what is your thought about their masterpieces?
Well, I agree with you. From Borromini, I think his masterpiece is Santiago. And I will say, from my point of view, and again, I'm not an architect. You're the expert, and your students are. Borromini approached architecture through geometry, and I would argue Bernini approached architecture through theater. And because if you look at Borromini, if you look at Santiago, it's essentially it was designed to be a six-pointed star, the Star of David, essentially, which is a symbol of learning, of knowledge. And everything in Santiago is a triangle or a circle that is used that are used in various ways to kind of convex, concave. And then when you look at the dome, when you look up into the dome, it almost looks like a some sort of like four-leaf clover or something. I mean, it's three-dimensional. It's not smooth. It's dynamic. And the interesting thing that I noticed in all of Borromini's buildings, you walk into the building, whether it's a church or whatever, and there's no moment where you can stop and take a pause before you step into the space. You're immediately thrust into the space. You have no choice. Which is why I always thought Borromini was much more sort of abrupt. It's like, in a normal conversation, you say, "Hi, how are you? I have a question about whatever." I envision somehow Borromini saying, "I have a question about this." I mean, there's no sort of like, easing from one space to another, which I think Bernini does particularly well. For my personal preference on Borromini, my favorite building of his is the Three Kings Chapel at the
Re Magi Chapel.
Yes,
the one with the blue ceiling.
Yes, the propagation of the College of the Propagation of the
The
Faith.
FIDE, yeah.
Yes. And what I like about it is it's very simple. It's essentially a rectangle with the corners blunted, because essentially Borromini believed that a corner was a waste of architecture. And then and there are no windows at sort of floor level. Your eye is drawn up, and there are vaults across the ceiling that it's the one one Borromini building where I actually feel a sense of calm. Santivo is brilliant, San Carlo is brilliant, but they feel like everything is sort of frozen and is about to explode.
You're in a whirlwind. You're in the eye of the storm, kind of thing.
Yes, and it's like the stone is moments away from shattering. And the Three Kings Chapel, I don't feel that. I feel a certain sense of sort of calm or peace or whatever.
Now, all three of these buildings, including Remangi, are very quiet in what we call material palette. So today would be seen as minimalistic. It's austere. Now, my speculation is this is both Borromini style, and that if you connect colors and materials, because colors is not paint, we're talking about using red, blue, green marble, that's the colors, yes. Or using gold leaf for everything. If you connect colors plus his forms, it would just be overwhelming, I would suspect. It's rumored, I don't know if this is true or not, that Borromini would always dress in black, and it's sort of a tradition that architects now hold guard. Is there any truth to this?
Well,
because black would be a very expensive color to wear in those days.
Well, people always said that he dressed like a Spaniard,
right?
Which is all in black, and the only color on him was the sort of rosettes on his shoes, which so he was considered, he was probably depressive, certainly he was known for being celibate. He had very deeply religious, and he was very serious, and he dressed that way. And I think part of it was, as you say, you walk into St. Peter's, it's alive with color, or you walk into some of the buildings that Bernini has designed, and it's so rich in terms of the marble or the gilding or whatever. Borromini used none of that. He was interested in form, and the message that he articulated about God, about the Trinity, about eternity or whatever, was all done through the buildings that he built. And there's, as you say, very little sort of difference between, maybe there's some red and green tiles on the floor, but everything else, you are forced to look at how the building is designed. And when you do that, you're brought into it in a way that I think very few other architects of his time was able to do.
Yeah, because in a way, his tiling at St. John the Lateran is black and white, and the angels, the cherubinos around the arches are all white. Yes. Santiago de Sapienza, the whole dome, as amazing as it is, it's all gray and white. It's all stucco white. So I also thought at some point, I thought, well, it's also a lack of money because, gold leaf is expensive. But I hold on more to that. It was his style. It was his preference. Now, going to Bernini's masterpieces, as I sort of preface, what it's the layman person would expect. But I want to speculate on something, and I want to ask you on your opinion on my speculation. So we talked about, because in your book, I think in a way you make a special place for Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. And for me, in my head, Sant'Andrea al Quirinale by Bernini and San Carlino being on the same street about 200 paces away from each other,
right.
It's kind of the same thing as a staircase inside of Palazzo Barberini. For me, it's one city block with two buildings, these two masterpieces. And the other one is one building with these two staircases, two masterpieces. But I mentioned before the oval. And now I want to get your sense of what I'm saying. And please tell me if I'm making stuff up. But my sense, and if the timelines don't align, like for example, the fountain, my sense is that Bernini is working on the correction of St. Peter's from the outside, which is creating that square, which is not a square, to be able to, as a visitor, want to stand back from the building. The colonnade wants you to move back so you can get the right vantage point so you can see the dome.
Mhm.
And so Bernini does this sort of an oval shape. And let's go back. Borromini does an oval plan in San Carlino. Borromini had done before that the oval staircase at Palazzo Barberini.
Mhm.
And now we see from Bernini the oval at the piazza in front of St. Peter's and a central planned church, which Borromini Santivo and San Carlino both are, and Re Magi as well, because it's more of a chapel.
Mhm.
Oh, actually, it is a chapel, which is about, I'm going to do that scale, Teddy. I think Re Magi might be bigger than San Carlino, actually, very probably. Again, Sant'Andrea is a centrally planned oval. Now, you mentioned the fountain does this structural kind of, in Spanish is algo, I forget the word for it, but it's like shouting, structural shouting to say, look, it seems like it's floating. I'm speculating if Bernini is using the oval to prove to himself, or in a private discussion with this Mozart and Salieri sort of competitor, saying, hey, I can do an oval too, and I can probably do it better than you. Because in Sant'Andrea, I feel that because he doesn't do it anywhere else. I don't know. What is your opinion on all this foolish stuff that I'm saying?
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things I didn't mention about the Three Kings Chapel is that the chapel that Borromini tore down in order to build his was an oval chapel that Bernini had designed.
Ah, I didn't know that.
And Bernini lived across the street. Bernini's family
Yes.
home was across the street.
Yes.
So the thing about Sant'Andrea Quella is that it is an oval church where the axis is on the narrow end. So you walk in and it's sort of wider on both sides than it is to walk to the altar. And to me, it is, when I think of it, it is a masterpiece. I will agree with that. It is a masterpiece. What is amazing to me about it is it looks like, to me, a stage set, because you walk in and it's gold, and you look ahead and there's a pediment above the main altar. And in the pediment is a statue of St. Andrew, Sant'Andrea, basically being, rising into heaven, breaking through essentially the pediment in order to kind of go up the dome and up into heaven. So it's this kind of very dramatic moment in a very small church about something that uses color, richly decorated side altars, side chapels, the floor. I mean, there's color and vividness everywhere that is in such marked contrast to San Carlino, as you say, down the street. But at the same time, it is something that is evocative and peaceful. And when at the end of his life, Bernini used to come there, and he told his son, and he would just sit there for, and he would told one of his sons that it was the place, it was the least bad thing that he'd ever done in terms of sort of how he built. And
he didn't, is it true that he did not charge for that design? Allegedly a loaf of bread or something like that.
And it was built for the Jesuits. And it's the front of it is kind of concave. In other words, you walk into this sort of small courtyard and there's steps up. It's a beautiful church. Now, for me, I will say my favorite piece of Bernini architecture isn't a building or church at all. It's the Scala Regia. It's the royal staircase that Bernini needed to create at St. Peter's as the entrance to the papal apartments. And what it does is it fit into a very narrow space between the church and the papal apartments, and the space got narrower. It basically was a long triangle. And Bernini created these steps up from St. Peter's that you go up, I don't know, 10 or 12 steps, and there's a landing. And at the landing is a statue by Bernini of the moment when Constantine has his when he's converted to Christianity. And there's a hidden light source above. It's basically a hidden window. And the light comes down on Constantine, who's on a horse, who literally is like, oh my God, I just saw God. Exactly. Yeah. And then what you do is you take a left and you go up this these shallow stairs to the papal apartments. And what he did was he created, he narrowed the stairway, and it's sort of a three-tiered. He narrowed the stairway, so it's a trick of the eye. So you look up, and there are various light sources to the top of the stairway that get sort of shorter. And as you walk up, in other words, it's an extremely dramatic entrance into the papal apartments, when it could have been, utilitarian and boring, and it's essentially a creative response, a creative answer to a particular problem. And it's theatrical and it's dramatic, and I think it actually works magnificently.
And that's your favorite Bernini space?
That's my favorite Bernini
Rome.
space. Yes, although I bow to no man in my admiration for the rest of the spaces, but I think it's a very neat trick he pulled off.
Two quick questions before we move to the final point, which is their final resting place. I never quite understood. There's two things. I remember Bernini hanging. Did I get this right? Bernini would hang from his house. I'm gonna say something very stupid, but this is what I thought I read. Because in front of his house, both Propaganda de Fide, which is really close, and then the Church of Propaganda de Fide, if I remember correctly, which is all in brick, which has one of the original angels for Ponte San Angelo inside of it. Borromini was working on the renovations for that and doing the cloister and some other things. And Bernini had a view from his house into it. And would he hang, did I understand correctly, bull testicles or something like that as an insult? What was it that I read?
Okay, that I completely, I would believe that, but that is not something that I've read.
Okay, that's not part of your research. Okay, I see. Again, you read so many things, you get involved in this, and you can't separate fact from fiction.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It would not surprise me if it turned out to be true.
Right, it would be something you might expect. I forget what was the other point, but it might come back to me. Let's move on to Bernini's travels. Yes. So does the timeline match that when Bernini was not in favor, he said, well, I need to kind of travel Europe and get work outside of Italy? How does one get to cut King Louis XVI's hair?
Well, what happened was that Louis XIV and
Louis XIV, sorry.
Yes, wanted the greatest architect of his time in France. So basically, when things were looking kind of grim for our friend Gianlorenzo in Rome, he wrote to the French king, and the French king said, "I'd love to have you in Paris. Come on over." And of course, previously, any overtures that had been made by other other important people in Europe to have Bernini come to Paris or Vienna or whatever, of course, were met by no by the Pope. We're keeping, I'm keeping my prized artistic possession here, thanks. But Bernini went to Paris, ostensibly to provide designs to Louis XIV for new wings of the Louvre, which he essentially, what happened was he tried to build an Italian palazzo in the middle of Paris. And those wacky neoclassicists in Paris were not happy about having this, genius, this Italian genius running around Paris, pontificating about what good architecture is. So after about 6 months of being, enjoyed, the king loved having him there. It was fun. He produced several designs for the Louvre, additional designs. But then sort of, basically he carved a bust of Louis XIV, which I think was at Versailles. It might still be at Versailles. And after about 6 months, it was like, oh my gosh, I have to go back to Rome. It's been so much fun, guys. We loved having you. Thank you. Here's your hat. What's your hurry? So the kind of French, the French neoclassicists didn't really much, or their idea of Baroque was not, that was not, Bernini's idea of Baroque was not their idea of Baroque. So they never built anything that he designed, even though the king loved having him and liked the prestige of having the kind of greatest artist in Europe around for a while.
Now, reading through the lines, was that also a good way to make the Pope angry?
Yes, it was a little bit. Yes, it was a little bit like, oh, somebody else likes me.
Right.
So it was, it was also, it's one of those things where I thought it would be could be an interesting movie or television show, in the sense of this, this Italian wandering through the wandering through Paris, wandering stranger in a strange land kind of thing.
It's amazing. We're getting to the sad end now. These architects, humans as they are, even though we sort of tend to idolize them, and who live on through their works, both had the opportunity to design their final resting places, which is not something a common man usually gets to do, right? So Borromini, being this sort of difficult person, maybe he would be diagnosed with Asperger's or something like that today, or other stuff. No family of his own. When he was doing San Carlino, he asked his client if he could be buried there. Yes. So in a way, that crypt is designed by him, knowing that he's going to be there as well. It's a very
he designed his own crypt. Yes,
right. To be there, knowing that, is kind of an impressive thing to see the mind working through where you're going to be laid to rest. However, Borromini, at the end of his life, through, I don't know if maybe you should kind of go through this, commit suicide. Right. And you explain that in the book.
Right. Well, what happened was, he, after sort of a series of professional reverses, and people were basically like, we've had enough of Borromini, thank you. And he kind of got more and more depressed, and melancholy, I think is the term they used. And so he was having difficulty getting to sleep. So he wrote his will, and then basically his servant, a guy named Francesco Massari, who was a stonecutter and servant, basically told him to go to sleep. And Borromini said, all right, I'll go to sleep if you promise that if I wake up and want you to light a candle for me, you will. And they're like, yes, of course I will. And then Borromini called for the in the middle of the night, called for a candle to be lighted, and Francesco was basically like, maestro, go back to sleep. And he wouldn't light the candle. And that, for some reason, was the tipping point. And so, literally, because what happened was, Borromini got up, he took out a sword, and he leaned the hilt on the bed and put the point of the sword to his side and fell on it, so that essentially the sword ran through his body from one side to the other. And obviously he fell on the floor with the sword in him, and began to scream and waking up the house. And Francesco ran in and opened the window and basically called for help. And what happened was, they pulled the sword out of his side, and rather than die, Borromini lived for another day.
One more day.
Yes. And it was one of those sort of public and painful sort of deaths about, and also weirdly dramatic. And at the end of his life, at that day that he was there, he decided that he did not actually want to be buried in the crypt of San Carlino. Where he wanted to be buried was the church near his house, San Giovanni de Fiorentini, which is where his kinsman Carlo Maderno was buried. So that's what happened. He ended up being buried in that church next to Carlo Maderno, and there's a small plaque on the floor of that church indicating his burial.
There's a black circle with his name, Francesco Borromini. Very, very austere, very fitting. Now,
not a pilgrimage site by any of the, in other words, it's not on the list of most people's, most tourist visits to Rome. It's not like we have to see Borromini's burial place.
No, you have to be a very sort of a sick architect like myself to
right. Or me. Yes, exactly.
Now, but I've got 3 lingering questions from his death. So presumably the lighting of the candle was in my head so he could keep on working on something.
Yeah.
Is this correct? He
Yeah.
wanted to, he had trouble falling asleep constantly. Was he sick at the time?
Well, the answer is probably. I mean, we would probably have a much more specific diagnosis now. He was clearly suffering from, some sort of mental anguish. It
Right.
might
So,
be, it
so it
could
was
be
not a
anything.
physical ailment, but actually the product of what was going on in his head.
Right.
Is this okay? He was not sick with like any sort of like pneumonia or anything like that we
Right.
knew about. Okay. So he was wanting to work. He got so mad that his servant would not follow his order, and he decided out of spite to commit suicide, but within a head that's clouded of depression and many other things.
Enough is enough, basically.
Enough is enough, calling it quits. However, he lives for one more day, and he recants and says, I don't want to be buried where I designed my own burial space. Now I want to be close to Maderno, whom became, in a way, sort of a father figure to him. But I was raised Catholic, Roman Catholic to be precise, went to an all-boys Catholic school. The church says that if you commit suicide, you cannot be buried at a church.
Right.
What was the discussion around that?
Well, that's a good question, because at least in my research, there was no like, hey, wait a minute, this is a guy who left this mortal coil perhaps a little more dangerously than we want. But it's also the one thing I can think of is that it's sort of the evolution of what was considered appropriate and proper in terms of Catholic behavior over the centuries certainly has evolved in some situations. And it may just be one of those situations where the church's teachings on this, on suicide or burying in sanctified ground, may have evolved over time.
Right. And the last thing that I had doubts with, if I remember correctly, in your book, you mentioned that there is a Bernini sculpture in San Giovanni dei Fiorentini, which is Maderno's design. But I've been to that church and I've been kind of looking. I think in your book you referenced that it's looking from above, but I've never been able to find it.
Well, I was going to say it might not be there anymore. It was at the time. It was at the time that I actually was there, and it's a bust of a, frankly, probably not that memorable religious figure, priest, or it might have been cardinal. And it certainly is possible it might not be there anymore.
But it was somewhere in the church where Borromini was buried, which is, of course, these guys, even in death, are chasing each other.
One more irony between these two guys, right?
Now, the final irony is Bernini's resting place, because from his architecture and his work, you would have expected a lavish thing, but he doesn't do that with his burial.
Right. He's very humble. And it might also be one of those situations too where you are trying to come across maybe as a bit more modest than you actually are. But it's in I think it's Santa Maria Maggiore. Is that where it is? Yes. And it's a small burial place for him and his family. And it's again, it's nothing, it's not elaborate or dramatic or anything like that. I mean, in some ways, his legacy, if you will, is the everything else that he built in Rome. So I mean, and it's kind of nice to think that somebody might be modest about his where his mortal remains might go, but every place else around it, he was dramatic and glorifying both the papacy and Christianity.
Well, it's an amazing story, Jake. Your book, like I said at the beginning, changed my life. From your book, I discovered the story that I was taught in school. I was taught these names and I was taught these projects, but they're dead if you don't tell the story behind them. It just brings them to life. So when I first reached out to you about the idea of this discussion, I said, why is this book not course curriculum? And I mean it. And I invite anybody out there listening that is remotely interested in art and architecture and history and a good story, as you mentioned, telling stories, to have a read of this book and look into the lives of these two characters and the history and the people around them, the popes and all the people that, had a play in what is the Rome that we have come to know today. I've given now free tours that I give to students because I feel I would have loved somebody to have given me this tour when I was a student. And I feel that they're being robbed of information if they don't get it. And in that note, I'd like to thank you again for your time and for your book. And I want to give you the last word. If there's anything you like to kind of comment as a closing.
Well, thank you for having me. I've certainly enjoyed talking about something that I've been interested in. And the thing that if anybody asks me what what I take away from this story is that these two were extraordinary men. They were extraordinary artists, and as much as they may have either disliked or been driven crazy by each other, they needed each other, because the world we are in now is because, or at least the Rome that we're in now, is because of them. And I can't imagine what architecture would have been like without the two of them being kind of constantly battling over the course of their lives together.
Without the rivalry, they would have not tried to be besting each other. Exactly.
Right. Exactly.
Well, Jake, I hope this gets turned into a series or a movie. I hope you're pitching that. I'd like to see it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.